Hi, thanks for watching. Okay, so this is going to be part two of the video series on how narcissism as a psychological phenomenon can show up in bureaucracy and in politics. Okay, so yeah, I mean, I'd like to ask you guys to watch part one of this video because I kind of explain how I see narcissism and why I think sort of my version of narcissism or the way I describe it really is not different really from the traditional definition. It's just I try to provide a more general definition, focusing a little more on what I see as kind of like the limitations in processing tolerance, um, basically just processing information, basically. That I think narcissism presents a very special case where a person sort of has a very strong intolerance and kind of irritation in processing information that's sort of just general information, basically. And that where you sort of have a limit in what you can tolerate in sort of processing information, you sort of tend to prefer information that's closer within oneself. Okay. And you're going to have to set a limit as to what information from the environment you want to sort of make a cutoff, sort of make a wall, and then outside that limit, you sort of just don't have the tolerance or the conditioning to process that information with full appreciation. Okay, because it takes a lot of space and it takes a lot of, if you're not accustomed to it and you haven't developed, say, you haven't conditioned yourself to be able to tolerate information. It's a burden. It actually burdens a person, and all of us have a limit. I'm just saying that the people who end up in that narcissistic place where they're only just concerned with what's very close to themselves, and they're very intolerant to really fully processing, information and consideration for things that are outside, including other people. Um, if you're not conditioned to that, depending on how close in your limit is, you're going to be relatively more either autistic or narcissistic, depending on how it shows up. So basically, even normal people have a limit. We all have a limit. I'm just saying that, to get into the range where you might end up with the classical NPD symptoms, your limit is probably very close in. Okay. And you probably, I would say, congenitally, genetically, temperamentally, you're probably a person who is very irritable and probably has a relatively low tolerance, irritability, low tolerance for just the burden of fully appreciation, of processing with full appreciation, having full appreciation in the processing of just general environmental considerations, basically just the data, just the just the information processing, basically. I mean, I'm taking it sort of to a machine language level, but I think that's kind of where I think that's really where the narcissism shows up. And then of course the symptoms are obvious. I mean, and we understand very well. All of us understand the symptoms. You tend to see more importance and more specialness and more status, in things that are very close to you. And as you get further and further away, getting into the realm of other people and people maybe that they don't share your opinion on something, as you go into the background, then things seem relatively diminished because you just don't have that processing capacity. You haven't developed it to take on the burden of all the environmental taxation of just taking to heart and really appreciating things that are maybe not so close to you. You know what I mean? And so it is a combination of temperament, but also habit. Because even if you don't really have the temperament, if you develop the habit and you develop the conditioning, you could extend your orbit. Let's say, relative to orbit, it's kind of like orbits. Like you can think of very close orbits, very intermediate orbits, and then extended orbits, and then even beyond the extended orbits. But all of that requires processing capacity. And when we actually process information through appreciation, not just processing it without caring, but processing it through caring, through appreciation, that takes a lot of, I think, even like metabolic energy. And I think, some people have a lot of irritation, irritability, intolerance of loading that metabolic circuit with all kinds of processing busyness. It's busyness. You're occupying all your processing faculties. And some people just develop the bad habit, or they just have, irritability or intolerance, and they just never get to the place where they've habituated themselves to just constantly taking on the load, the processing load of really appreciating and taking to heart and processing with caring, deeply caring, all the information beyond just the immediate circle, the immediate orbit. And so, if that's kind of the way we're looking at narcissism as kind of like the extreme of that, then we also have to admit that even normal people have a certain limit. It's further out. Normal people have a more intermediate limit, but if those people are placed in extraordinary circumstances, okay, they will seem relatively narcissistic for extraordinary circumstances. So it all depends. If you have a normal level of, let's say, narcissistic limit of what you can fully appreciate, okay, it's kind of intermediate orbit, then probably as a career, and as you go about life, you probably want to choose a career, or you probably are better off, let's say, in a career in a situation where you sort of have an intermediate level of difficulty and dealing with intermediate level kind of issues. But as issues get more important and more dangerous and more high stakes, you probably want to be a person who has a more extraordinary capacity for environmental, for taking in and taking on the burden of a broader environmental taxation. Okay, so I think this is where I kind of differ from how psychology defines narcissism, because I'm looking more at the cause of narcissism, not the symptoms. Okay, the cause of the symptoms. Okay, I think the cause of the symptoms of narcissism has to do with our tolerance for taking on the loading of environmental taxation through our metabolic process of full appreciation. Okay, full appreciation. That's a lot of metabolic processing. It's a lot of, or even just neurological processing. But I think it is also metabolic, because neurology is connected to the metabolism. So I think in the end, it is a metabolic, a broader, deeper level of metabolic processing. Okay, so basically, I guess, looking at it that way, if we look at narcissism that way as a limitation, either in terms of conditioning or basic just innate tolerance, okay, and the two go together, because you could have, like, say, a low innate tolerance or a low genetic tolerance, but you could develop through conditioning, at least develop some, but it's one or the other or both, okay. But whenever a person presents with a limited conditioning level, okay, where they're just not conditioned and they're just not adapted to taking on a lot of environmental consideration, okay, in deep appreciation, all right, and that would be that metabolic capacity, okay, then we're going to see sort of a limit as to what they're able to handle is, like, say, their panorama, like the let's say the scope, the distance of their panorama of what they can take in full meaningful appreciation. Okay, so that's, like, we can call that the narcissistic limit for anybody. Okay, now in the case of normal people, their narcissistic limit is sort of intermediate level. Okay, where they can include their family, their friends, let's say the politics that is in agreement with their beliefs, and let's say maybe neighborhood considerations, community. But extended consideration, probably not so much, because that goes beyond, let's say, their meaningful limit. Okay. And so I'm just proposing that if we look at that as the model for narcissism, okay, which really is not in conflict with the traditional model of narcissism, okay, but if we're looking more at, let's say, our conditioning and tolerance for environmental taxation, how far out can we go before we're at our limit, okay, either through conditioning or through genetics, or both. Okay. Once you get to that limit, everybody has, let's say, sort of a place where they start to be narcissistic with regard to the broader world. Okay. And so that will show up, I think, in politics and in bureaucracy. Okay. Because not everybody involved in politics and bureaucracy is actually extraordinary in their ability to sort of, hold in their full appreciation, like a broad orbit. Okay. And I think also, like, our traditions in politics, we have in the last 200 years or the 250 years, we've sort of had a tradition, I think, in the world politics of, let's say, revolutionary politics of conflict, politics where what we do is we put the dialectical process out into history, out into the the broader world, and individuals are just fighting for their cause. You know what I mean? And when you're just fighting for your cause, it's almost like you're reinforcing that limit where, yeah, I can be concerned with myself, my countrymen. I can be concerned, let's say, with my my ideologies, the people that I agree with, but there will be some limit, and outside, that's the enemy. And history will synthesize those things. That'll be synthesized through history, not on an individual level. So we're sort of like reinforcing that, yeah, we'll have some extension of our let's say environment, of our taxation environment, but our ambit of appreciation will only go so far as where the territory starts for, like, say, an enemy or people that believe in something else. So over time, let's say subconsciously in this kind of revolutionary part of history, okay, you can see how we would arrive to the place we are today, where you could have, like, say, a Democrat. A Democrat believes in what they believe. They have their things, they have their things they hang their hat on. The Democrats right now have geopolitical ideologies, like say what we see with Ukraine, like really hanging their hat on, countries have to be independent, they have to have self-determination, and of course they only espouse that for certain countries, right? But whatever. But let's say in the case of Ukraine, so they have this kind of like ideological like flagpole, but then beyond that, like say the more tedious considerations, like have we also, let's say, induced Ukraine over the decades to sort of like, have we induced them to sort of develop an expectation that is not realistic, right? Is Ukraine also maybe riddled, with a lot of corruption? Is it not a healthy society? Like all these other little considerations. And then also, are they really going to be so independent? If we keep inducing them and nursing them, basically, are they not going to become sort of an extension of us? So you get so tied up in these kind of like banner platform ideologies that you sort of lose perspective to the broader reality that maybe the situation is not so idealistic as we see, as whatever. But we're used to this because in revolutionary politics, you sort of get inflated with the flagpoles and the platforms of your own ideology, and you just take it to war and you just skirmish against your enemies. And the process of history, the externalized process of history, will synthesize it, and we don't have to synthesize it. In other words, we don't have to take on the full appreciation for what's outside our ideological interest. And I think that is kind of like the unfortunate sort of I guess the stage of history that we're living in. We're still living in sort of the hangover, I think, of the old revolutionary types of, the modality of history, that's sort of the revolutionary modality, where you just get inflated by your own ideological interest and just take it to war, basically. Even though the war may not always be a physical war, but it's just like, say, the political war. So we see that today, like on the domestic level. We see that in the United States, if you're Democrat, you just get inflated with all this kind of slogan importance of like, things like, labor unions and we need to have like liberal immigration policies and, just expand the availability of healthcare for people and forgive student loan debt and just all these kind of like quick things that I'm not saying any of those are necessarily bad, but it depends on the measure. It depends on the realism. Okay, but if they're just slogan issues that are just kind of like ideological fantasies, okay, they're not nuanced. They're not really tempered. Okay, and I think the idea is that, hey, this is revolutionary mentality. These are our big banner ideals, and we'll just take it to the warfare of the political, sort of the political warfare, basically, in the United States. So it's not real warfare, but it's the mentality of warfare, where we'll just through our skirmish with the enemy, somehow that'll all just kind of synthesize, and we can live in the world of, ideals, just sort of unmitigated, sort of unnuanced ideals, And so it's a very comfortable place, but everybody is sort of just only at that intermediate level of meaningful consideration, where we don't take in the dirty parts, the asterisks. We don't take in the kind of the realism that you can't live in a world where we have, like, say, the ideal labor unions, where labor itself just becomes this power, such a power. I think it sounds nice, but there are maybe a lot of other nuances where, in a sense, the labor unions could be sort of almost an analogy to what we see in Ukraine, where the labor unions almost become sort of like an extension of the party, sort of party politics. You know what I mean? Like the labor unions are so enabled and so supported by, like, say, these democrat forces, or these like pro labor forces, these political forces, that they become almost like extensions, and they're not really independent. They're not really the workers anymore. It's really the sponsored workers, and they're sponsored by political interests. And so the workers are no longer this sort of like independent. The fantasy doesn't come real. Just like Ukraine is not really an independent country if they're so sponsored by us, that now it's only a simulation of independence. And what they really are is they're just kind of they're kind of like a how would you say, they're sort of like an extension of Western world, the Western countries. So they're not really that independent. They just become like an affiliate, basically, affiliate nation. Okay, so anyway, bottom line is, how does this sort of political narcissism, how does this play out, let's say, on the domestic side? Okay, and so basically two issues are, let's say, obvious issues are how Democrats manage big cities. Okay, just one example, and also the immigration. Okay, and like I said, I am personally not opposed to immigration. I'm not necessarily like on the Republican or the Democrat side. I mean, I think just realistically, immigration is inevitable in any country almost. There's always going to be some immigration there. You can't have a country without some immigration. Countries are like, the membranes of a country are sort of permeable. People go in, people go out. You can't have it. There's no country in the world that doesn't have some level of immigration. Okay. And so that's not, I don't think that's really on the table, as, whether there will be or won't be immigration. But the question is, do we reach a point where effectively it's just sort of uncontrolled, or even if there is some processing of immigration, are we unwittingly, are we sort of allowing sort of an inflow, like a flooding effect, where it's like, say, not healthy. Like, say, what would happen to the United States if we just keep having just massive, unchecked, well, relatively liberal immigration, where we're just taking in a flow of immigrants. And I think these are just real questions. And I think Democrats, they're so into their kind of the ideal that we should have relatively liberal immigration, and they hold that as such an ideal that they can't really also be bothered to also consider that, where does it reach a point where it's a problem? They don't take that on, because traditionally you just hold to your banner issue, and let the effect of history, and let the conflict with other parties, let that process it, and sort of like, it's like external dialectical processing, as opposed to taking on more discomfort to have your ideals, but also say that, hey, at some point it does become a problem, and to take that on as well, and to be more realistic. And so as it stands now, because the Democrats, are they're not narcissistic, but they have ordinary level of narcissistic, let's say, tolerance limitation, where they can only, like all normal people, you can sort of only deeply process things that you care about up to a point, and then beyond that point, well, we'll just leave it to the conflict of politics. And so you just get politics that is just really just not very satisfying. It's not very effective, because it's just a lot of disagreement, a lot of clashing, and I don't think it's very healthy. So I guess all this is to say that, maybe this is just a suggestion. It's just a suggestion to say that just being ordinary, just having an ordinary level of tolerance, just because you're so ordinary, and you're able to extend your orbit of considerations in life, so that you're technically not narcissistic, so that you're technically expanded enough that you don't qualify technically as being a narcissist. Okay, maybe that's not really enough. That maybe that's relatively speaking a kind of narcissism, that maybe we should all aspire not just to technically not be narcissistic, but we should aspire to be even more extended, to where we're not even ordinary. And I mean, people would say, well, that sounds very narcissistic. You're sort of dreaming of a world where people are extraordinary. Okay, well, try to take it in a non-narcissistic way. I'm just suggesting that if all of us could not be satisfied with a mediocre level of environmental tolerance, tolerating full caring, appreciation, processing of things outside our immediate or intermediate orbits, okay, to more extended orbits. So where, just as an example, like say, I may fully believe beyond my own personal interest, extending now, okay, I may fully believe that we ought to be more liberal, let's say, in how we allow immigrants to come into the country. Okay, fine. But can you also consider as well how there could be problems if it gets excessive? Okay, how it could destabilize the country if it's just so unchecked, if there's not some regulation. Okay, and even if you believe that we're at a good regulated position, like right now we do have some regulation of immigration, in the sense that even though a lot of people come in, they're still subject to immigration laws, and a lot of them are processing like, say, asylum claims or whatever. But a lot of people say, well, okay, yeah, it is a problem, so let's just hire more judges. And then you just get this massive staff of, like, say, judicial, like administrative immigration judges and all these attorneys to process. It's just throwing bodies and just making this massive immigration complex. Is that really the solution, or is that just the easy way of thinking? Should we not also consider that, having too inflated, let's say, a bureaucracy, how that could actually be a problem? How maybe we're not really solving the problem just by making a massive bureaucracy of it. But in order to do that, you have to be able to extend your realm of consideration beyond just things that you believe in. To also consider how what you believe in may at some point become a problem. And so that requires a more extraordinary extension of our orbits of deep consideration, And so I'm just suggesting that maybe all of us, Democrats, Republicans, independents, just normal people, that the aspiration, we should not be satisfied and happy with ourselves just because we're technically not narcissistic, just because we're mediocre at a mediocre level of an extended realm of considerations, that we can process deeply. Maybe we ought to, all of us, maybe consider that for the world to be healthy, at least on the level of politics, on the level of bureaucracy, on large scale levels where we're dealing with, geopolitics, we're dealing with the stability of a country, economics, macroeconomics, that maybe the standard for all of us is maybe a much higher level of tolerance, a much higher level of processing capacity for taking on deep caring, deep consideration of issues that go far beyond even what we believe in, even the banner platform issues that we subscribe to, let's say, as sympathetic to a particular political party. That maybe all of us should aspire to expand even beyond our realms of interest, okay, and take on more discomfort of having to process more in our, let's say, the metabolic circuit of our deep caring, okay. And so, I'm just suggesting that, because the issues we're talking about are so big, okay, that maybe the standard for dealing them is not being mediocre and ordinary, but actually extraordinary. And I don't mean in the narcissistic fantasy of extraordinary. I mean in being truly extraordinary and taking on much more discomfort. And so I guess to summarize all of this, I would say that I guess what I'm proposing is maybe rethinking what we consider to be adulthood. Okay, that adulthood is not just turning 18. Adulthood is not just being, having an intermediate level of considerations that makes us technically not narcissistic. Okay, that's just too mediocre, and without being narcissistic about it, without being unrealistic about it. Being realistic about it, to suggest that maybe for the world that we have today and the kind of issues that we have today, and maybe just in general, maybe the standard to be an adult should be more extraordinary, and that maybe we ought to even consider that maybe an intermediate level of, let's say, processing, let's say, conditioning, to be able to, let's say, an intermediate level of environmental processing conditioning, okay, that even an intermediate level is technically a kind of narcissism. It's just a a light narcissism, but it is still a dangerous narcissism, okay? Because the more intermediate and mediocre we are in our ability to really meaningfully care about and process, let's say, issues of the broader environment, if we're only have an intermediate level ability, okay, effectively that is very dangerous, and that can result in very inefficient politics, and it can result in a lot of wasted money, a lot of wasted debates, a lot of putting everything into just the warfare of politics, and also maybe just blunders on the geopolitical level, like how we're dealing with Ukraine, and that maybe the standard that we should carry, understanding the consequences can be deadly and can be very devastating to the world, is that maybe all of us should aspire to a much deeper, a much more extraordinary level of taking on a deep caring and having deep caring for things that are not just even in the intermediate orbit, but even beyond, and things that are beyond are not just other people. Okay. It's not just other people. It's other ways of thinking, other considerations. Okay. So even if you're very good at caring about other people, we can all ask ourselves, am I good at caring about other considerations, other points of view, other ways of looking at a problem? Okay. So I may be a very humanitarian person, and I may really care about, like say immigration, and I may really believe that we need more immigration judges. We need to process more asylum cases, whatever. But can I also take on not caring about other people, but the other consideration that maybe there is a point where you get such a hyper bureaucratized system that you are creating sort of something that's not very realistic, not very manageable, and may also be very problematic economically, because who's going to pay for all those judges? You know what I mean? In other words, is it really such a burden for a person to want to see a solution, okay, and to dream, let's say, of having more immigration judges, let's say more immigration infrastructure, but also to consider deeply how much is that going to cost, and to consider, like, at what point are we taking on too much cost, And so I just think these are all fair questions, and I think it's also a reflection for us as we get to know what narcissism is. That it's not just, narcissism is not just the let's say the stereotype of just an arrogant person who only cares about themselves. I think narcissism also presents itself in public, in politics, in bureaucracy, as basically a mediocre limit of our range of what we care about deeply, okay, and sort of an insensitivity to issues that are outside the range of our favorite ideas, okay, and that can really, that phenomenon can really affect people, very well-meaning people who are involved, let's say, in politics or activism or bureaucracy, okay. So anyway, I'm sorry if I have any difficulty sort of explaining myself, or maybe I'm not as eloquent as I'd like to be. But I just really encourage people to think of narcissism in terms of our ability to tolerate the discomfort of processing environmental considerations. Okay, basically, it's our tolerance for environmental considerations processed at the level of deep caring. And how deep caring we should, I think, consider that maybe it is a form of metabolic processing, and that maybe we should aspire, all of us, to expand our conditioning for how much metabolic processing we can tolerate as sort of a baseline, okay? And that does involve taking on more discomfort because it's a loading, and it's sort of an assumption of environmental taxation, okay? And taking it on with welcoming it, and knowing that will produce more maturity in all of us. And I think the more we can take on, I think in the end, the better our discourse, our political discourse, and the more efficient our politics, and even our economics, and better even our world politics, geopolitics, that could all be improved if we as people improve to become more extraordinary, and to set the standard for adulthood as more extraordinary, not just technically not being narcissistic. So I just put it out there, and I really appreciate your patience with my sometimes difficulty putting things into words, but I really appreciate your patience, and thanks for watching.